Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning to those of you in the US and that time zone. Welcome to this webinar on how to encourage life science investment in the countries of the Global Gulf Cooperation Council. My name is Philip Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Geneva Network, which is a UK-based think tank working on innovation, trade and development policy. And we're delighted to have three very interesting speakers today to discuss this issue. I'll introduce them in a moment, but first a bit of background to the issue. Why are we discussing this? Well, in my view, knowledge-intensive sectors such as biopharmaceuticals, IT, chemicals and entertainment increasingly underpin sustainable growth and employment in OECD countries and other countries that have become wealthier in recent years. For example, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan have moved over the recent decades from agriculture to manufacturing to knowledge-based industries. China is now very far down on this course. As countries in the Middle East and the Gulf region look to diversify away from oil and natural resources, they too will need to pay close attention to growing their own knowledge-based industries and participating more meaningfully in innovation, global innovation networks and global value chains. And the innovative biopharmaceutical industry is in its infancy in many Gulf countries, yet it could play an important role in assisting the diversification away from oil and transitioning towards this more knowledge-based, sustainable economic model. And various development plans in the region recognize this, such as Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, UAE's Dubai Industrial Strategy of 2030, and Abu Dhabi's Vision 2030. All of which single out the biopharmaceutical sector as a development priority. So alongside a robust regulatory environment and adequate R&D infrastructure, an effective intellectual property system is key to mobilizing the large investments needed to fund these risky R&D ventures. But it's not just IP, there's a whole host of other factors, which hopefully we will touch upon today. So on to my panelists. We're very pleased to have Marwan Abdulaziz, who is the Managing Director of the Dubai Science Park, one of the preeminent R&D investment destinations in the Gulf region. We have Stephen Ezell, who's the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation in Washington, DC. He writes a lot on international innovation policy, gave quite a good global perspective on the issue. We have Mark Schultz, who's Professor of Intellectual Property Law at the University of Akron in the United States, and also writes widely on the role of IP and other innovation policy factors in the life science sector. So as we did advertise that this webinar will last for an hour and a half, I think we are going to do 1 hour today. I think that's enough time to cover the ground. And it will take the form of a moderated discussion. So I'm going to ask panelists questions and they're going to do their best to respond. So to kick off, I think we'll turn to Marwan. So why should countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, why should they ensure that life science and biopharma do play a key role in their economic value, in their economic development plans? What does the sector bring in terms of economic value, jobs, development? I mean, why should a country like the UAE be interested in this?
Thank you very much, firstly, for having me. It's an honor to be amongst panelists like yourselves. I think if you look at a very big picture, what's very important is that the energy sources should be diversified so that economies are not fully reliant on oil sources, oil as an income for their economy. So if you look at what can drive the economy more than just oil. So first, it's important to diversify the energy sources and also the GDP. UAE, I think, is a very good example because we're not a country that has a lot of oil. We do still are a big oil producing country, but if you look at Dubai specifically, it knew 30 or 40 years ago that oil can never be the only driver And this is why there was a big focus on trade and logistics, finance, tourism. So it has created a diversification for its GDP. Um, and although pharmaceutical industry was not a big highlight for the economy, but most in the last 10 years or so, it has been playing a bigger and stronger role, mainly to support the setup of companies in the region to use it as a hub for the region. So the first question that we asked ourselves, how can we have or create regional hubs for companies like the pharmaceutical companies? And this is when we learned that IP is very important, and we need to be very protective of the IP. So it's important to be welcoming to those companies. So for them, they set up and they expand their businesses, but also at the same time understand very well, how does the IP protection work. And the way we have looked at expanding the presence of the biopharmaceutical industry is by taking it step by step and doing what's easier first. So we first started by creating regional centers for those companies, and Dubai, obviously, with its logistics infrastructure and connectivity, has been able to do that very well. And then secondly, we looked at what companies can do more than just regional offices. And the second step was a localization of some manufacturing, and also central distribution for the region and sometimes for the globe. And what we're looking at as a third step, and I think this is the most probably the biggest jump that we will do, is how can we incentivize, or how can we encourage companies to do research. And obviously by that you need to look at your local capabilities. For academia, you need to look at the readiness of hospitals doing clinical trials. So it's really an entire ecosystem that needs to be created.
Thank you, Marwan. And to the audience, if you have any questions or comments you'd like to bring up, please put them in the chat box, and I'll try to get them read out, or we'll try to get them answered as we go along. So please do send them along. So turning to Stephen now, Stephen Ezell, a more global view. What does the life science sector bring to countries' economic development plans? Why should it be a sector that's prioritized as opposed to, I don't know, chemicals, for example? What does life sciences bring?
Well, thanks, Phil, for the invitation to be here today. Always great to be on a Geneva Network panel. Yeah, maybe to respond to the first and second question. One reason that the life sciences sector should matter for GCC countries is that actually it's a key driver of economic growth. If you look at the UAE from 2014 to 2019, the sector achieved 37% economic growth, contributing about $20 billion more to the UAE economy. Saudi Arabia experienced similar growth. Their pharmaceutical sector output increased from 3 billion in 2008 to 9.3 billion by 2001, a threefold increase, with 42 billion of pharmaceutical expenditures from 2017 to 2021. It's also a key driver of foreign direct investment. The UAE experienced about $820 million of FDI over the past 4 years in the sector alone. So it's a key economic growth driver for GCC countries and countries around the world. But one key reason that the life sciences sector matters to countries is that it's not just about the economic and employment contributions the sector makes to an economy. It's actually also about the economic and life contributions that the product the sector makes to the world. So if you consider research from Frank Lichtenberg at Columbia University, he finds that from 2000 to 2009, pharmaceutical innovations accounted for 73% of the life expectancy at birth for citizens across 30 middle and high income economies across the world. And the evidence of that is clear from the United States. when we have innovative drugs that help citizens live longer, healthier lives, it generates tremendous economic benefits. In fact, improvements in US life expectancy from 1970 to 1990 added $2.8 trillion to US productivity, which was the equivalent of adding $12,000 per US citizen to their GDP per added year of life expectancy. So one of the key points I want to make to the viewers on this webcast, especially those from the Gulf region, is that countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, you're not simply high-income economies. You're now a group of wealthy countries who have a responsibility to unleash the unique and creative, innovative talents of your citizenry to produce innovations in the life sciences and their sectors that benefit not just your own countries, but all of mankind and humankind, and contribute to the types of life sciences innovations that are going to raise global life expectancy and standards of living for citizens throughout the world.
Thanks, Stephen. And Mark will come to you in a bit. I wanted to turn back to Marwan. I mean, before we get onto the policy discussion, what is it about not just the UAE, but also some of your neighboring countries that make it an attractive destination to set up R&D? Is it, for example, the science base or the geographical location? Perhaps you'd like to elaborate a bit on that.
Sure. I think, I mean, number one is really the willingness of the government to be working with companies and also creating incentives that are, bespoke to each and every company. Secondly is the availability to data and to patient information that can be quite unique of the diverse population that the region has. And also, very recently, there has been a lot of studies that shows that the region is becoming more and more attractive to people from around the region. So in terms of being a talent magnet, if you will, to the immediate region, rather than that talent going very far to Europe and the US, they can still be in the region. And that, I think, is a very attractive thing for companies. I mean, again, I would emphasize on the investment in infrastructure that has been done, that is specific to life sciences, and also how the entire economy is based on making sure that it's easy to do business, it's easy to transact, it's easy to do interact with other countries in terms of trading, for example. And when you have an entire economy built on making sure that companies and businesses do well, then everything seems to fall in place.
And just building on that, obviously I don't want you to criticize any of your neighbors, but do you see any neighbors doing well, or because Dubai is obviously a standout success in the region, right, but do you see any other neighbors that are catching up with you closely?
I think it definitely, there is a little bit of catching up happening from a few of our neighbors, which is a good thing, because it's also making us wanting to raise the bar and do more, for example. So very recently there has been a lot of announcements by the government, supporting UAE nationals to go into the private sector, creating a bridging program, for example, for those who choose to go into the private sector, giving them access to the same pension program, government pension program, even if you go into the private sector. So a lot of things to encourage specifically the local population to work in the private sector, and also the ability to have a golden visa, which is a 10-year residency, things that we never had in the last 10 years or so. So I think the competition around us is making us want to do more. And that's, you know, definitely very good for companies and for investment in general.
Thank you. That's an interesting answer. But let's turn now to the policy factors. And Stephen, I know you've written a lot on this. Perhaps you could delineate at a broad level the policy factors that it takes to encourage biopharmaceutical R&D investment, because it's not a straightforward form of capital. It requires a sensitive government that understands the complexity of the industry. Perhaps drawing on international experience, what could the countries of the Gulf region learn about what the policies are? Which ones are best?
Sure, Phil. So, I think there are a set of answers there that are both on the demand and the supply side of an economy. At the broad framework level, and I know Mark will talk more about intellectual property, but the reality is that it's very difficult to have innovation without the protection of ideas. And that's a fundamental starting point for any nation that wants to be competitive in the global bioeconomy. We'll talk about creating the innovations, but one important thing as well is the regulatory environment that countries put in place to enable life sciences innovation. If you look at the United States, the reality is we actually used to be a global also-ran in biomedical innovation. In the 1970s, European headquartered drug companies introduced more than twice as many new to the world drugs as the United States did. And as late as 1985, only 10% of new drugs introduced in the world were introduced first in the United States. And a large reason why that was we had a very poor regulatory environment for drugs. Back in the early 1980s, it took our FDA 36 months, almost 3 years, to make a safety and efficacy determination on a new drug. So a good regulatory environment that provides pathways for innovative new drugs to be cleared more quickly. Good conversations between innovators and regulators is very important at that systems level for a country. But on the innovation side, bringing new drugs into the world, there are a number of effective policies countries can put in place. Of course, one of the most fundamental is investing in research and development, basic life sciences R&D. And ideally, that is money that is provided to researchers at universities, corporate or national labs. And then there are effective pathways put in place to facilitate the commercialization, the transfer of those technologies. If you look at the US experience, one of the most powerful things we did, again, in the early 1980s, was something called the Bayh-Dole Act. This was legislation that enabled universities and researchers to control the intellectual property rights stemming from federally funded research. And that was critically important in creating a pathway where innovations could be protected and brought to the private sector. Another lesson from the US experience has been the criticality of turning universities into engines of innovation in a society, and finding ways to architect effective public-private partnerships between academia, industry, and government is very important. Again, in the US experience, an initiative we have called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR, is a government program that provides essentially seed startup money to innovative tech companies coming out of US universities to help overcome that initial valley of death. So the gestalt of lessons here is robust levels of federal R&D investment in the sector, but then mechanisms to translate that R&D into innovations that can then get commercialized inside a marketplace.
Thank you, Stephen. And Marwan, I forgot in our previous discussion, so I'll divide this question into two. Firstly, the end game for the UAE, Dubai in particular. How far do you think you could go as an R&D center? And then secondly, building on what Stephen's just been talking about, what do you view as the most important policy factors to enable that to happen? So a two-parted question, if you don't mind.
Sure. I think we've done a lot of work already, and I think for you to be able to attract R&D, it's like it's building bricks basically that you need to put together. It's not one thing or the other. I think we've done a lot of it, we have a very few things that are left, and mainly I would say is bridging the gap between academia and industry, and creating these programs to push innovations out from the university, and then have it sponsored by industry, and then have it basically go to market. So that is something that is currently happening. The universities are really changing their perspective from doing basic research to translational research, and working closer and closer with universities. But this is fairly new. It's probably maybe 10 years old. So we need a little bit of this needs to be pushed a little bit. Some support from the government is definitely needed. And also, I would say, making sure that the ownership of IP is done in a way that is very, very clear. Today, some universities would claim a part of the IP, if the IP is generated in the university, and that claim can vary from 10% all the way to 50%. So there is no clarity as to if the IP was created in the university, who has how much, and I think a little bit of policy around that would take us a very long way. But I also want to emphasize that innovation does not only need to be in biopharmaceutical. The biopharmaceutical world is quite unique, quite complex, but today healthcare can be disrupted by digital health, by other avenues, really, not only specifically biopharmaceutical, which may or may not be easier than biopharmaceutical industry.
Thanks, Stephen. Sorry, I'm not sure if you're listening to that, but there's some big ambiguity about ownership of university inventions, and this is probably a good lesson for all the countries in the region. Do you have any case studies of other countries that have successfully implemented a Bayh-Dole type legislation that our colleagues in the Gulf could learn from as they try to build their own environments there?
Well, I would point out that the economist called the Bayh-Dole Act, when it was introduced in 1982, perhaps the most inspired piece of legislation introduced in America in the past quarter century. Also, separately, the Hill looked at the 10 best pieces of legislation in US history and identified the Bayh-Dole Act as being one of the top 10. The Bayh-Dole Act approach has been copied by 24 countries around the world, at least by now, including South Africa, including Zimbabwe, including Kazakhstan. So there are a number of countries out there, developed and developing alike, that have introduced similar types of legislation, affirming, what rights universities and researchers thereat have to innovations that stem from federally funded research initially. I would counsel all GCC countries to enact similar legislation and to look at implementation from these 24 countries, at least around the world. And happy to provide a formal list of those if you would like subsequently.
Thank you. Yeah, feel free to circulate that later on. But now let's turn, before we move on to Mark Schultz. Sorry, Mark, to keep you waiting in the wings there. And I realise it's early there. So apologies. Feel free to munch on your croissant for another couple more minutes. But Stephen, let's talk a bit about, we talked about the do's. How about a few more less helpful policies? And this is just not unique to the Gulf. I know a lot of countries around the world, and not just in the Gulf, try to boost both manufacturing innovation through localization policies, in which, in order to invest or to sell, for example, you're compelled to either, build factories or transfer technology in return to license to operate. Can you talk a bit more about this? What it is, if it's taking place in the GCC, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of this approach, and if it's helpful to the the overall objective of boosting investment into R&D.
Sure, absolutely, Phil. And I have a couple of slides in preparation to your question. Can you see this, Phil?
Yep. Yeah, all good. Great. Thanks.
So, we wrote a report in 2013 that looked at countries' localization, barriers to trade, LBTs, and we developed this matrix for contextualizing countries' economic development strategies. And at the top, we would have ITIF's preferred approach, what we would call enterprise support, helping all firms in all industries compete, and a national approach to increasing productivity and innovation across the board. However, some countries in the world, or some countries' policies in some sectors, view it differently. They may distinguish between the activities of domestic and foreign enterprises in their economies and the way they try to attract investment there. So these policies in general seek to decrease the amount of imports into their country and increase exports. So you could have indigenous innovation policies like China, which focuses specifically on favoring domestic enterprises. You have general mercantilism, like currency manipulation, where you try to boost imports and reduce exports. But many countries are focusing on these LBTs, and they come in four main types: either local content requirements, local production as a condition of market access, forced technology or intellectual property transfer on foreign forms as a condition of market access, or forced data localization policies. And while in some cases such policies can be effective, we don't believe they're the ideal approach to economic competition. Unfortunately, we are seeing some of these types of practices in GCC countries. As we know, the Saudi government has been increasingly focused on localization, purchases of goods and services, and increasing the percentage of Saudi nationals employed by foreign firms. I feel like the pharmaceutical sector, as outlined in Vision 2030 and the National Transformation Program, it aims to boost the proportion of local manufacturing of pharmaceuticals to 40%. Almost all GCC countries have price preferences of at least 10% in government procurement activity, and local content requirements of up to 30%. And we're seeing more data localization policies as well. For instance, the UAE's health data protection law introduced a general prohibition on the transfer of health data outside the UAE. And Saudi Arabia is requiring foreign firms to store and process data in the country, quote, to ensure preservation of digital national sovereignty. But ITIF would contend that it's much better when countries try to deploy an attraction than a compulsion strategy to attract globally mobile investment into their countries. Why? Well, localization policies unwittingly harm domestic competitors by raising production cost, and these inefficiencies ripple across entire industries and economies. Look at Indonesia. So about 5 years ago, or I'm sorry, in 2011, Indonesia introduced local content requirements for electronics manufacturing. What happened after they introduced these LCRs? Well, they lost 30 manufacturers, and Indonesian exports of ICT goods declined by 50% in the ensuing 5 years. ITIF wrote a report over the summer where we looked at the increasing amount of data localization policies across the world. We find that countries that introduce such data localization measures, which cut off the flow of data, which is a critical input to innovation, that a 1-point increase in a nation's data restrictiveness cuts its gross trade output by 7%, slows productivity by 3%, and hikes domestic prices by 1.5%. International research collaboration is critically important to innovative industries, especially in the life sciences. But when we start to restrict the flow of data, especially health data across borders, this impedes international research collaborations and biomedical discovery. Finally, localization policies cause reputational harm. They really encourage foreign companies to only invest the bare minimum that is required by a nation and no more. The lesson is clear, I think. It's perfectly fine for countries to want to increase domestic levels of manufacturing, to want to attract as much high value added production to their shores as is possible. But the best way to do so is through an attraction strategy that's predicated upon a very strong innovation policy environment, good digital infrastructure, great access to pools of talent, good regulatory policy, a stable and predictable business environment, but attract it, don't force it.
Thanks, Stephen. Very interesting. So, I mean, are there any examples of countries, smaller countries, that have managed to boost high-tech manufacturing through through encouraging or cooperating rather than the coercive approach that you outline? Can you cite any examples?
Yeah, absolutely. Check out Costa Rica. Costa Rica is the world's third most high-tech intensive exporter. Very strong exports of ICT goods, of medical devices, and they've done that by aggressively entering into free trade agreements with countries around the world to create zero-in, zero-out tariff environments. That's made them hugely competitive in ICT production, for instance. A very strong regulatory environment for high-tech industries, from life sciences to ICTs, AI, et cetera. A small country, but it's dedicated its entire approach to a good business environment and strong rules that encourage trade and investment in high-tech industries. By the way, there's one good other example broadly. I just finished writing a report on the Information Technology Agreement, the ITA. This is a WTO plurilateral trade agreement that eliminates tariffs on trade in ICT goods, first introduced in 1996. But the point of the ITA was that it was negotiated on a most favored nation status. So if you're in the ITA, you have to offer zero tariffs to any country in the world exporting ICT products to you, whether they're in the ITA or not. Now, a lot of people think this creates a free rider problem because Pakistan cannot be in the ITA. They can impose high tariffs, and all of their exports must be received with no tariffs by other countries. But while it seems good, what's happened is that countries not in the ITA have found their participation in global value chains for the production of ICT products declined by 60% over the past 15 years. The point is clear. If you don't offer a zero-in, zero-out tariff environment, you simply get circumvented in global production chains. And that's as true in ICT as it is for the life sciences.
Thank you. Interesting. And feel free to circulate that report in the chat box. Send it to the attendees. That'd be great. So Mark, sorry to keep you waiting. Let's talk a bit about intellectual property rights, which is, as mentioned earlier on, one of the key policy factors that can make or break a country in terms of investment into this biomedical R&D. So speaking broadly, can you give us your take on why IP is important in the life sciences, focusing specifically on investment into countries of the kind you find in the Gulf region?
Certainly. So the role of intellectual property is really a foundation from getting a product from the laboratory or the inventor's bench into in people's hands, customers, patients, and so on. And at every step from the invention, whether it's in a university lab or a business's R&D facility or somebody's basement or backyard workshop, there needs to be investment. There needs to be collaboration between many different parties, and intellectual property is the foundation for that. You see, there's really very few things that any one person can do alone or any one entity. When you think about, for example, we've talked about the role of government laboratories and investment in universities, and think about what professors do. People like me and many of my colleagues, most of us aren't good business people. I would never hire 99% of them to manage anything. And yet they're quite clever at inventing and coming up with discoveries. They're often quite uninterested in practical applications of those discoveries. So how do you get, say, a really interesting potential discovery from the laboratory into development, into a product, and then all the way through to developing something for a patient. Well, an interesting, real life example. I talked before the pandemic. I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Derek Rossi for the academic founder of Moderna, of vaccine fame, of COVID vaccine fame. I interviewed him for a different project before, unrelated to the pandemic. But I talked to Dr. Rossi about investment, and he knows something about investing in startups and ideas. Moderna was the first company launched out of his academic lab, but it wasn't the last one. 3 more were launched from his academic labs, and before he actually left academia, after he'd had enough experience watching other people do this, to become the CEO of a startup biopharma company. But what Dr. Rossi said to me is, he said, look, it all starts with great science. And he loved talking about the science, as scientists do. It takes great science. And I think we might add, from looking at what Steve said and Marwan said, it also helps to have government investment in infrastructure. It helps to have a sound financial system. It helps to have a legal system you can rely on to enforce your contracts. But under all of that, the foundation of all of that is intellectual property rights. And here's why. Intellectual property rights create an asset. And as Dr. Rossi said to me, he said, you could have the coolest idea in the world. This was his words. You could have the coolest idea in the world, but without intellectual property rights, nobody will invest in it. Now, why did he say that? Nobody will invest in it because if you can't protect your investment, if you can't secure a return on your investment, then there's no point in making the investment. You stand to lose the investment. You always, when you invest in life sciences innovation, really any startup company, you have a very large chance of failure. Most startup companies fail. Most biopharma startups fail. But a few succeed, and that's what investors count on, that when they do succeed, that there is a potential reward. The one thing that they can't tolerate is that success becomes its own risk. What do I mean by that? If you succeed in developing a successful life sciences product and competitors can then copy it, or governments take away your rights, then it becomes an entirely too risky investment. On the one hand, you have a very large chance the product won't work. On the other hand, if the product does work, it's taken away from you. Why in the world would you ever invest in that? You would invest in something like a lifestyle brand, a luxury brand, food and beverage, a hotel, anything. But the life sciences where success becomes a penalty. So first you need that security to get that investment. And what that investment does then is takes the innovation and allows it to be put into a commercial entity like a startup. And the startup is where the practical applications are developed. As I said, the university researcher, the government lab researcher, they're interested in their research. They love it. They're not interested in developing a practical product. So then in the startup, the hard work of applied science is done to create a treatment that actually can, that the human body can use and make use of safely and effectively and consistently. And that can take many years. So with Moderna, for example, in developing their mRNA vaccine technology, they worked for about a decade. So did BioNTech, the other company that eventually partnered with Pfizer to make an mRNA vaccine. They both worked about a decade on this. They both took on hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars in investment, private investment, in order to develop their technology platform. But then what happens? Well, sometimes the startup grows enough and develops enough capability to take the product further. But it's quite often the case the startup then has to turn to another partner. They may sell the company to a larger partner, a larger biopharma company, or they may take on a partnership. And what the larger biopharma company can do is take the product through clinical trials, which is also expensive and risky. One of my friends, one of my oldest friends who works in biopharma always says that clinical trials always break your heart. They break your heart because you think you have a drug that is going to do wonderful things and it fails. Most drugs do fail in clinical trials. Clinical trials cost tens of millions of dollars. The price escalates at each stage as each stage of clinical trials gets larger. And then once the drug has proven out in clinical trials, there's probably about $1 million worth of work to get the drug approved by a regulatory agency. You're not done then, though. You actually have to develop a manufacturing capacity and a distribution chain, and all of those require investment. At every stage of this process, there is investment and a risk of failure and a loss of investment. And as I said, that is acceptable to investors, except if they lose their investment because other companies and competitors come in and copy them freely. Success cannot be penalized. And so the IP provides a return on investment. But the last thing I'll note is that intellectual property isn't just a way of securing a return on an investment. It helps foster collaboration. Look at each of these steps I talked about. What happens at each step is you take knowledge and a new and useful and helpful application or invention, and you turn it into something that people can collaborate around. They can work together on it. So you take something that is invented in a laboratory and you turn it into a patented invention, which can then be licensed or sold to the startup, which then develops more technology, which is also protected, but also because it's protected, they're willing to collaborate with others. Without that protection, it would be too risky for them to work with others. I mean, right now, vaccine manufacturers are teaching vaccine developers like Pfizer, like Moderna, like Johnson & Johnson. They've spent the last 18 months teaching other manufacturers, including some of their competitors, how to make the product. They could never do that. They could never work with a contract manufacturer and teach them the recipe, teach them their manufacturing methods without the protection of intellectual property. It would be insane. It would be giving away your most valuable asset to a competitor without intellectual property protection. With intellectual property protection, you can actually do those kind of collaborations. So to sum it up, intellectual property is the foundation of an innovation ecosystem because it incentivizes innovation, but just as importantly, maybe more importantly, it provides security for investment in development and commercialization of a product, and it serves as the basis for necessary collaboration and cooperation across the economy. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. A comprehensive answer. And I think we can all agree that particularly for the life sciences IP is highly important given the capital intensity of it. So thank you for that. A quick question for all three of you now on the topic of IP. So the WTO TRIPS agreement provides basic IP standards. I think all the countries of the region have signed up to it and implement the provisions of the TRIPS agreement in their national law. Question, I'll put this to Stephen first, then Mark, and then Marwan, perhaps you could comment from the Dubai perspective. Are those basic standards enough, given how life science innovations changed in recent years? Or do you think there's any benefit in going beyond TRIPS and making standards a little bit higher in order to facilitate investment and innovation? And are there any countries that have done this to success? So I'll ask Stephen just to quickly give us his thoughts, then Mark, and then Marwan, perhaps you could talk a bit about how Dubai, what its IP strategy is, if it's sticking with the basic standards or trying to differentiate itself through higher standards. Yeah, just try and keep your answers a little bit brief if you wouldn't mind, because we're butting up against the time a little bit now. Thanks.
Hey, Phil, I'll just say that, well, as you know, with yourself and Mark Schultz, we have an initiative called Innovate for Health, which is available on the Medium platform. I put the link in to the chat. But what Innovate for Health is now a compendium of over 55 case studies of innovators from developing countries throughout the world, from Saudi Arabia to Peru to Malaysia. And in all cases, these are stories where local life sciences innovators have been enabled and empowered by more robust intellectual property rights and regimes in their countries. One of my favorite stories in there is from Cameroon. A gentleman named Arthur Zhang actually invented the first portable cardio EKG in the world in Cameroon. And that gave rise to a very large life sciences innovation and medical device ecosystem in Khartoum, capital. And as Arthur Zhang will tell you, it wasn't until Cameroon and 4 other countries in Central Africa joined WIPO, strengthening their IP rights, that he felt he had the ability to undertake innovative activity, secure in the knowledge that his innovation could be protected. So I think especially if we're talking about drugs and life sciences innovation, as we increasingly move from chemistry-based drugs to new biologics, right? That these involve far more complex productive activities. They're ever more expensive and intensive and difficult to make, and that just means that it's ever more important that countries put in place strong intellectual property rights. And this is true for the generic side as well. In the future, if countries want to be in generic industries, they're going to be increasingly in biosimilar activity, right? The generic copies of biologic drugs. But that means that it's the pipeline of innovative drugs that we create that sustains the generic industries on the back end. So I think for innovative and generic industries alike, countries should put in place as strong IP rights as possible.
Thanks, Stephen. Mark?
Sure, and I'll be briefer from now on, Phil.
Nice. It wasn't my criticism at all. Don't worry.
No.
Enjoy your answer.
It's quite all right. It's a professional hazard of having professors speak. We do go on. Okay, so TRIPS is part of the World Trade Organization, and it's a trade agreement. And so a lot of times, many countries approach their obligations under TRIPS, which is the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property. They approach them as a trade issue. I mean, quite practically, often this means that intellectual property issues reside within the authority of the trade negotiators or the Ministry for Trade or whoever negotiates trade for a government. And they're thought of as a bargaining chip in trade agreements. Well, we won't, a country may say we won't increase our IP, the strength of our IP laws willingly or voluntarily, because it's an important bargaining chip to get market access from other countries. If you want to export more to the United States, you may choose not to increase your IP rights. But then what happens is you're no longer focusing on intellectual property as a domestic development strategy. And that's the largest benefit of it, not appeasing your trading partners, not complying with an international agreement, but instead countries are best off focusing on intellectual property as a domestic development strategy. So move intellectual property from your trade ministry and trade negotiators to your domestic economic development commerce ministry, and you're going to benefit. And a few smaller countries that have benefited over the years are, well, first of all, there's a historic example of Japan that enjoyed tremendous economic development, eventually becoming a high IP power. And in recent years, China has focused on intellectual property as part of its innovation strategy. But in between those two examples, you see smaller economies such as Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, and Ireland that all have very friendly business environments, but friendly business environments with a strong IP foundation that has encouraged both foreign direct investment and exports.
Thank you. And Marwan, tell us a bit about Dubai's strategy on IP. You're on mute, I'm afraid.
Sorry. I was just saying that it's interesting to note that even prior to the UAE having an IP policy, which was only introduced in the year 2000, in the early 1990s, there was an agreement with the Ministry of Health and a number of pharmaceutical companies where there was an agreement to protect IP as long as the IP was valid in the country of origin. And that was the case for a few years until the IP law came in fact in the year 2000, and then there was an adoption to that, if you will. But the IP is a very important pillar for attracting investment and encouraging foreign direct investment. So we've made some recent changes last year and issued a decree 321 that clarifies the years of protection of IP, whereas in the past it wasn't very clear the period of protection. And this makes it fair to generic players and also to international companies. And I think this would keep on developing and improving as we go. But one of the things that I'd like to call for on this forum is for the GCC countries to have one cohesive IP policy or IP registration, if you will. Because at the end of the day, the UAE is a small market, and other GCC countries do not constitute a large region. However, I think a harmonization of IP protection and registration would make it very, very attractive as a country. And also for new IP registrations, right? If you are a university professor working on an IP that would be accepted in the entire GCC, that makes it even more appealing. So I think it goes both ways.
Thank you. I'll second that. And let's hope negotiations and discussions continue in that direction. And still on IP, Mark Schultz. So regulatory data protection, which is more widely known as data exclusivity, is emerging as an important intellectual property right, particularly given the rise of biotech drugs. Can you just give us a quick overview of why it's important and why GCC countries might want to care about it? Given that there is a basic requirement within TRIPS to protect it, but I don't think this IP right is widely understood amongst those who are not IP specialists, such as yourself.
Certainly. So, when a biopharma company applies to market a product in a country, they usually have to divulge. They have to reveal a large amount of data, and of course, this is completely acceptable. We all want to ensure that drugs are carefully vetted and approved. But think about the fact that most companies don't have to tell you their recipes, don't have to tell you all of their testing results to sell a product. Nike doesn't need to do this to sell shoes in a country, for example. They don't need to reveal their secret manufacturing capabilities. Coca-Cola doesn't need to tell you its recipe. And so because there is this data on deposit with governments, there is a chance that data could be used by competitors. And in fact, competitors do eventually use this data. Generic companies use this health and safety data, this data on ingredients, in order to form their basis of their application to market a generic drug in a country. And so they rely on this data. And here's the challenge then. If a company, a biopharma innovator, applies to market a product, turns over all this data, and a generic company then could immediately use this data to also justify its application, there would be no point in ever making this investment in doing the work and expense of making the application to market a drug, accumulating the data. because you could immediately be undercut by a generic competitor. So what regulatory data protection or exclusivity provides is that for a limited time, competitors cannot use the data generated in clinical trials to file their own applications. It's anywhere from 5 to 12 years, depending on the countries. It's an emerging standard. And as I said, it's really important for both access to medicine, because companies are unwilling to invest in establishing a market where they can be quickly undercut. So many drugs will not arrive in a country without regulatory data protection. So it's important for access to medicine, and it's ultimately important to biopharma innovation, manufacturing, and other parts of the industry. You know, when companies look as to where to do business, both where to sell drugs, but also where to do an R&D and manufacture drugs and set up regional distributors, they look at the IP climate. And if they find, you know, deficiencies, they're just, you know, less likely to invest in those countries.
An excellent explanation, Mark. And for those who are interested, I'd like to share this new paper that we've just produced, kind of explaining the rationale behind regulatory data protection, why it's important, and indeed why Gulf GCC countries should protect it. And on that, there's a question come in. I think Marwan is probably best placed to answer this, from Kataiba Al-Manasir, who writes, regulatory data protection in the UAE is 5 years only, while 8 to 12 years is usually found in countries that are R&D hubs or R&D leading markets. Is there any plans to reconsider this in the UAE? Are you aware of any changes in the law coming up?
I think this is under negotiation with the policymakers. So I believe this would change, because I do agree that it's very short. Okay.
Thank you. So we'll watch this space.
Yeah.
And then wrapping up, I wanted to also get Mark to quickly talk a bit about patent linkage. So countries often don't, their drug regulatory authorities don't have to notify innovators when competitors apply for marketing approval for their generic medicines, which can sometimes lead to generics being marketed while the patent's still in force, which kind of undermines the whole point of the IP system. So perhaps, Mark, you could explain how some countries have addressed this anomaly and how it fits into the life science ecosystem.
Certainly. So, you know, drug regulatory authorities in some countries, well, the US, for example, does know, that keeps a registry of relevant patents called the Orange Book, and it checks applications for generic drug approval against those registered medicines and notifies the innovator. And you know, different countries have slightly different regimes, but there's a variety of things to do. But the key thing is that there is no silent approval of a generic. When you have drug patent linkage, there's no silent approval of a drug without the innovator at least finding out and perhaps having an early resolution mechanism where the innovator can intervene and say, you know, object and say that they have a patent. One of the advantage, and this may seem like an obscure issue, but to make it clear, it often happens in India that generic companies apply to market patented medicines. They're approved by regulators, and it's a large country with a lot happening and many drug producers. It often takes an innovator company a long time to find out, and by then a large portion of the market's taken. Or sometimes it's the health ministry itself. This happened in Saudi Arabia with hepatitis C drugs, chooses to procure a drug that is still under patent. So the challenge here is I guess one of the reasons to have a patent linkage system is to encourage, first of all, access to medicine. You don't want companies that are wary of marketing, getting approval to market an innovative drug in your country for fear that it will be too easy or too complicated to take, to defend its rights. And then second of all, it reduces litigation costs to have some sort of early resolution of the case. Which is also ultimately in both an investment and access to medicine problem, because yet another cost of doing business in a country without patent linkage is you may have to engage in costly litigation to defend your rights. If a health authority approves drugs that are still under patent. Generics of drugs that are still under patent. So, ultimately, patent linkage can encourage innovation, streamline the system, lower litigation costs, and thus make for a more attractive environment, both for investment and establishing markets for new drugs.
Thanks, Mark. Another excellent explanation. And to add on to that, I'd like to share with the audience a new paper we've just produced talking about patent linkage in the GCC and why it's important and how it works, building on what Mark's just explained. And Marwan, perhaps you could quickly talk about patent linkage in the UAE. I gather that there might be a system in place. Is that the case?
Yeah, the decree that I spoke about earlier, the 321, is a decree that clarifies the years of exclusivity, and also it provides a patent linkage to the innovator. So this decree is issued late last year, and it was extensively also shared with the industry, and there was a lot of workshops between the regulator and the industry. I think this is one of the key factors also, is, prior to launching any policies and regulations, is the inclusion of the industry to what will be, released or what will be issued, because if it does not serve the industry, it does not make it more appealing and attractive, then, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot, if you will.
Yeah, we had a comment in saying what's remarkable in the UAE is the level of access to policymakers and officials, and the inclusive nature of how the private sector can offer proposals that would strengthen the UAE's competitiveness in life sciences, efficient regulatory systems, high standard IP, open doors and transparency in policymaking. UAE is second to none in the Gulf, so that's praise indeed. I hope things continue well for you. So just to wrap up, we're a couple of minutes over. Stephen, do you have any sort of closing comments on, in your view, the main things that GCC countries should be focusing on as they head down this innovation journey, given where they've come from with a heavy reliance on commodities and those sorts of industries? Obviously, Dubai is a slightly different case.
Well, maybe two thoughts. First, across all high-tech industries, I would just encourage policymakers to employ, as I said, an attraction, not a compulsion strategy, and to bring investment and high-tech companies into these sectors. And second is, there's enormous opportunity to leverage the wealth that countries in this region have been bestowed with, and they should, I think, envision a responsibility not only to transform their own societies, but to recognize that they have been given a gift that, if they channel it into genuine innovation, can add value to citizens across the entire world.
Thanks, Stephen. And Mark, I know you visited the region prior to the pandemic. Is there any concluding thoughts you have on the journey of the region as you see it in terms of innovation?
Well, certainly, I think there is a real opportunity. Any country that has the kind of wealth, resources, and education that you find in the Gulf region has a real opportunity. And people everywhere are innovative and inventive. We as human beings are all equally creative in this way. But what makes the difference is whether there's a proper environment, whether the environment encourages you to realize that potential. And so, as the Gulf countries, improve that environment through formalizing intellectual property regimes, through ensuring confidence that in doing business, there's all the potential in the world to develop into innovative and leading economies.
Thanks, Mark. And Marwan, where do you see Dubai in 10 years' time from a life science perspective? Just as the final thought.
I think one of the key things that is really driving the economy is talent creation and talent attraction, and these are two key pillars that you see being focused on all different levels, whether it is in education, in medicine, in policy making. So the focus on human talent, I think, is really pivotal to changing and adopting the economy. And what we want to see is for more IP to be created in the region rather than us being users of IP. And I think this is something that will be very nice to sort of be a goal to work towards. And definitely a lot of the pillars or a lot of the building blocks have already been put in place. Great,
and that's an achievable ambition, I hope. Well, thank you very much to all my panelists, Stephen Ezell, Mark Schultz, Marwan Abdulaziz. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you for starting so early in the morning for our American panelists. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. I'll be distributing some of the documents that were shared to you all afterwards. And thank you very much for viewing and for your time. And we hope to see you again at the next Geneva Network webinar. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.